In the 1960s, a New York adoption agency split up infant twins as part of a controversial study. Now on BBC World News, Melissa Hoganboom tracks down some of the participants as well as one of the researchers involved to understand why. Now on BBC World News, Split at Birth.
February of 2018, there was a 2020 episode about Louise Y's agency separating identical twins back in the mid-60s. And my older sister, who's adopted, called me and said, "Can you imagine if either of us are a twin?" I said, "Well, that's ridiculous." And then I remember getting a shiver all over my body thinking, wow, what if this was real?
In the 1960s, an adoption agency in New York, the Louise Y Services, began a policy to deliberately split up identical and fraternal twins and place the infants in different families. The adoptive parents were never told that their children had siblings.
Any Louise Y's adoptee from the 60s has every right to think that perhaps they have a twin.
The separated twins were placed in a controversial study to explore what makes us who we are and how much is defined by nature versus nurture. But at what cost?
It's so emotional for me. What they did was so unethical. It was so amoral.
Stories of twins have long captured human imagination. There is something beguiling about having an identical copy of yourself and the resulting bond that would create.
Hi.
Hello.
Pam, Pauline.
Yes.
Which one's
Yes.
which?
I'm Pam. I'm Pauline.
Pauline.
Yeah, come in.
Great.
Identical twins share all their genes, having split from a single fertilized egg within the first 2 weeks after conception. Fraternal twins share half their genes on average. They result when a woman releases 2 eggs at the same time, and they're fertilized by 2 separate sperm. So they have 50% of their genes in common on average, like ordinary siblings. Comparing resemblance in identical twins to fraternal twins gives us a handle on whether or not genetics has an effect. It would if identical twins are more alike than fraternals, and they invariably are.
For decades, they have been the focus of scientific research. The study in New York came to light when identical triplets who were separated at birth accidentally discovered each other.
Studying twins gives us enormous insights into how we come to be the way that we are. Twin studies are a natural model for looking at genetic and environmental influence on behavior. And what we are finding is that many more behaviors than we ever would have thought do have a genetic component to them.
Tea served. Thank you very much.
To try to understand the unique relationship twins have, I went to visit Pauline and Pamela, identical twins who grew up together in East London.
I can look at her and I know what she's thinking.
Yeah.
And I know what she's feeling.
Yeah. And if it's something funny, then
we've had it. haven't
that's
we?
it.
You can't do a thing with us, can you?
And tell me a bit more about what your unique bond is like.
It is so hard to describe, but our lives, because of the virtue that we're twins, I think it's more entwined.
It's like you are the other half. We've always said that, haven't we?
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
We knew that we started off, as one, and then we've split.
Yeah. And it feels like that.
We look so alike, I couldn't tell us apart. Who could you?
No. It's me and my shadow, It's unique, and we're lucky to have it.
And what was it like growing up with an identical twin?
Yeah, we always knew when there was something wrong with the other one, didn't we?
Yeah, so you're always there. She's going to cry now.
Well, I spent many years looking at identical and fraternal twins who've been separated at birth. It's very important to include the fraternals because they're the natural control group. And what got me into twin research initially is that I am a fraternal twin and always fascinated with the similarities and differences, mostly differences that my sister and I have. I used to wonder as a child how this could be if we had the same parents and same environments.
Though it's rare, twins are raised apart for a variety of reasons, from parents splitting up and taking one child each, to mix-ups in infant wards, but never before had twins been separated as part of policy.
When I first got to the University of Minnesota in 1982, I heard about this controversial study in New York City that took place in the 1960s and 70s, in which an adoption agency, the Louise Y Services, felt that it was beneficial to twins to be separated to grow up apart, to develop their own identity. At the time, there was a researcher, Dr. Peter Neubauer, at the Child Development Center at the Jewish Board of Guardians, who had always wanted to study twins raised apart, and here was his sample.
Neubauer had a colleague and friend named Viola Bernard, who was the advisor to the adoption agency called Louise Wise Services. So she had placed a set of twins in different families back in the 1950s. And when she told Neubauer about it, he said, they must be studied.
Well, the scientists, they were the masterminds of this study, Neubauer and Bernard.
Kathy and her sister Laurie were deliberately divided as infants as part of the research program. They only met as teenagers by chance.
And we were really deprived of being sisters and let alone twins. And I think it was just horrible what they did.
We met with Dr. Viola Bernard to find out why they split us up. And she just kept saying they were satisfying, two families who couldn't have children. We thought it would be better when it comes to competition for twins to have their own identity and not grow up together.
Parents would dress them alike and treat them exactly the same. In her terminology, shared an ego. So she didn't think that was very healthy.
They said that it was backed by the child development literature at the time, but I can tell you honestly, there is no such child development literature in existence. They never named studies.
The Louise Wise Services and the Jewish Board of Guardians, both once well-respected entities, have long since shut down, passing on the adoption and research records to Spencer Chapin and the Jewish Board respectively. In a comment to us, the Jewish Board strongly distanced themselves from the research.
There are fraternal twins who were separated but not studied.
Alison and her fraternal twin sister Michelle were also split up by the agency. They met by chance as adults, age 54.
I've been talking to a New York Times reporter, and she said you really should take this because this is maybe bigger than you.
This was my first conversation with her, and it feels like yesterday.
I really think we owe a lot of people some help with this too. I think this was such a wrong that they did.
As the adoption agency began to split up twins, social workers within the agency voiced objections.
So even though Viola Bernard was able to push this through, it wasn't unanimous by any stretch of the imagination. And that was not something Neubauer had led on. He said this was the practice of the time.
They split us up to study us. We were part of this child study, nature versus nurture.
Lawrence Perlman was briefly involved in the original study as a young postgraduate. He is one of the few researchers who have spoken publicly about their experiences.
I joined the study in 1968. I was 24. My job was to organize the data, and there was a wealth of data. So the idea was to try to tease out what differences there might be as a result of the different families that they were raised in. Thus be able to understand the relative contribution of heredity versus environment. Part of what we did during the time I was on the study, which was maybe 10 months, was to go and visit the twins. And I would test the child, do some film samples of them.
They would give me these exams, these tests, and they'd be filming them. And I remember, I think I felt very anxious when they would come to the house.
And there were many, many different tests given to them. Intelligence, personality, emotionality. They were filmed, they were photographed, they were observed. The reason it was done was because the researchers felt that the previous twins raised apart studies looked retrospectively at development and really could not capture development in real time. Here was an opportunity to track development in real time as it unfolded. The twins were placed with adoptive families who were not told that their child was part of a twin pair. They were not told the real purpose of the study. They were told only that their child was in a child development study, was already enrolled, and it was very obvious that if they did not accept the study, they did not accept the researchers coming to the home periodically, they probably would not get this child.
They all had an older sibling who had been adopted. from Louise Weiss, and that was kind of the hook that they had in terms of getting parents to agree. Because they had had an older sibling adopted, there was a sense of how competent the parents were.
And remember, these are parents desperate to have children, and so as one mother put it, I would have learned to fly if I could have a child. And so having researchers come to the home was almost an advantage. They could learn more about the child and more about psychology and adoption.
My mother, she agreed. She was a psych major and knew the importance of child development studies. But the fact that it was a twin study, they weren't told the truth.
The study soon ran into issues.
As the children began to age, some of them were upset by the study and didn't want to do it any longer. Apparently, the researchers ran out of funding.
It had always been a kind of shoestring operation. It was really self-funded pretty much by Neubauer and Bernard.
And so the study pretty much came to a close, but there were other problems too. In the late 1970s, there was a real interest in informed consent procedures in this country.
Arthur Kaplan is a professor at NYU and a medical ethics expert.
So the landscape of ethics in research during the 60s was a mixed bag. We had had terrible experiments conducted by German scientists under the Nazi regime in the concentration camps, and as a result had issued codes of ethics for research to bind researchers internationally. Number one principle in those codes, the Helsinki Code of Ethics, was the informed consent of all subjects is absolutely essential. However, there were violations of that code, which, by the way, was written by Western judges, including Americans. It was as if we said, well, the Nazis had done bad things, but American researchers, we don't have to worry about that. We wouldn't do such bad things. But we were doing terrible things, and this twin experiment took place during the 60s as part of a series of these violations.
There were some informed consent forms drafted early but never properly signed. They tried to make it ethical in the 70s by getting parents to sign it, but some did not, and some didn't think the form adequately covered what their child and they had been through.
Children who were related to one another, who were adopted out to different families, and the children and the families didn't know they had siblings. And that is an incredible violation of their right to know. When they're dragooned or bamboozled into a study, they absolutely have a right to know.
It was wrong, it was unethical, and was damaging to these individuals.
After an offer to pursue a clinical career, Lawrence Perlman resigned from the twin research program after just 10 months.
But I always wondered what had been the outcome of the study. But years went by and I never heard of any reports. That was surprising because this was such a unique study. I became an investigative reporter, essentially, and began to track down people who knew anything about the study.
Eventually, Perlman would meet psychologist and twin specialist Siegel, and together they would confront a 91-year-old Neubauer at his Madison Avenue office.
Nancy had asked, how could they justify separating these twins without informing the parents? And he defended that practice, saying that, again, it was Viola Bernard's idea. He was not going to acknowledge any responsibility for having done anything wrong. So that was just his stance. He just dug his heels in. So then we asked, well, what was the plan if they in fact met one another by chance? Because they were all in the metropolitan area.
Kathy and Laurie did almost meet by accident.
When I was around 6, I used to play with my neighbor 2 doors down, Bruce and Amy, and they said to me, Kathy, we met a girl who looked just like you and acted like you and talked like you, and I'll never forget Barry, who's my fiance now, and his brother, when I was in 5th grade, said, we met your twin sister. And I said, I don't have a twin sister. And he said, oh, yes, you do.
The girls were pulled from the study after the researchers became aware because they felt it would affect the data.
But the horrible thing about this was that Dr. Viola Bernard told both parents these twins cannot meet and do not tell them that they are twins. So the parents had to live with this difficult, important knowledge and never tell their child. Both girls were dancers, and when they met, they were 17, and they met secretly without their parents' knowledge.
I saw Lori crossing the street, and I just saw the way she walked, and a big smile on her face. And, then we hugged, and it was quite an experience.
It was surreal. I felt like I was staring at myself in the mirror. It was beautiful. I was in such awe of the whole thing.
There were so many similarities, and we shared so many similar feelings and perceptions and artistic inclinations.
When I met with these kids, I was struck by how similar they were. And not just the physical appearance, but their whole personalities. It was quite clear to me that the genetic influences were very strong.
These were psychoanalytically oriented researchers who placed heavy weight on environmental influences and on parenting. And suddenly, they're confronted with twins raised apart who end up being very, very similar. The beauty of identical twins raised apart is that they share only their genes and not their environments. So any resemblance between them is tied to their common genes. Genetics is not everything, but it does explain a great deal of why we differ one person to another. We find that height and weight have substantial genetic components. We find that general intelligence has a substantial genetic component, a little bit less than some of the physical traits like height and weight and brain waves. But nevertheless, it's a substantial genetic component, as does special mental abilities. And then we drop down a bit when we get to job satisfaction. Probably the most surprising findings in the last 20 years or so have been that things like religiosity, how much you invest in religious activities and interests, and political attitudes and social attitudes have a genetic component to them.
These findings come from years of data collected from retrospective studies of twins raised apart, and not the Neubauer-Bernard project, which itself was fundamentally flawed, as it didn't include a control group, fraternal twins, even though they were also separated. This was the reality for Alison and Michelle, even though they weren't studied.
My son gets an email on Ancestry from a woman in New Jersey who basically blurts out and says, "I'm your mother's twin sister." Michelle and I got connected and were reunited, and it was unbelievable. Physically, there were a lot of things that were similar. You could tell we were sisters, and there's a lot of pictures of us wearing clothing that's so similar. And we grew up on opposite coasts, so it's pretty incredible. And then the more we got to know each other, the more that we realized we were similar, emotionally, and how we looked at life and how we lived our life.
We find some amazing similarities in identical twins raised apart, many more than we ever would have anticipated. Not just in the more traditional areas, but in some more unusual habits, such as a pair of twins who both used to scatter love letters around the house to their wives, and both bit their nails down to the nub, and both explained their same mixed headache syndrome in exactly the same way as if someone is beating on their head with a hammer. These are very challenging, and you can ask yourself, are they due to just random chance? My answer to that is no, they're not. And the rarer they are, the more I believe it's somehow tied to their genes and the way the genes interact with their environments to produce these kinds of unusual similarities.
This is certainly the case for Pauline and Pamela, who mirror each other in extraordinary ways.
I always knew she was pregnant more or less about the same time she did, because I used to get the pregnancy arthritis in my fingers.
And she used to come to me and say, "You're pregnant again, aren't you?"
We've had similar operations, but it might be the other leg. We do sort of mirror each other, and it is bizarre.
And when people hear about twin studies and how much of our nature seems to be genetically determined, does that, take away from our own sense of agency or our own control?
It's very important to appreciate that genes do not work in deterministic ways. They work in probabilistic ways. They predispose, but they do not provide the final word. Just because you have a gene doesn't mean it will always be expressed. It takes a certain environment to bring that out. We all have genes that will be expressed given a particular environment. With identical twins, they have the same DNA, but sometimes gene expression can occur in one twin and not the other. And this can create differences between them. And these environmental differences that trigger different gene expression might even start in the womb. And so it doesn't mean that we're set in stone, that we can't change.
And describe to me how you two complement each other.
Although you are identical and that bond is always there, you are different as well. You've got your own opinions and your personalities. Pauline had one half of the bedroom, I had the other, and hers was all pristine and dusted, and mine was like a tip. I was very girly and she was very tomboyish.
I was more academic, Pam was dyslexic. We didn't know that then. She's a lot more creative, I'm not at all creative. Right, so when I was a child, the one thing I always wanted to do was join the police from about the age of 4.
I ended up both police officers, but if you'd have told me in my 20s and 30s, I would have gone never in a million years. It's weird because identical twins, a lot of the time as they get older, they grow apart, but gradually we've just sort of grown into each other, really. We look more alike now. We'll look after each other for as long as we can. We're going to just do that forever now, really.
I couldn't imagine, I think it would be the cruelest thing. If you were a twin, you didn't know you were a twin until you reached a certain age. You know, you would have got on with your life, but I think once you were actually told, when I look back at everything we've done together from Dot, I would just feel so cross and so angry that we'd missed out on all those chances and, you know, this unique relationship that we've got. You'd never have that. You'd never have that forever person next to you. So I think it's tragic, actually.
You could really cause severe harm, marital disruption, battles down the road between children and their parents. Potential for harm is real. The potential for violation of basic rights, absolutely present.
Once reunited, Alison and Michelle had less than 3 years together. Michelle passed away from pancreatic cancer in early 2022. Alison feels her loss keenly.
I was just in awe about how bright and funny and smart she was, and she was positive, just literally to the very end. And I try to learn from that and live from that and try to have that be the way that I'm living my life because I met her.
For Laurie and Kathy, the impact of finding out that they were separated has been profound.
We could never, go back because we were twins, but we weren't sisters. We didn't grow up together. And even to this day, that's been a very difficult part of our relationship. Maybe you'd meet somebody, I would say, oh, I'm a twin. Oh, that must have been so much fun growing up together, and you dress the same and, you look the same. And instead of saying, no, that didn't happen, we were separated, I just didn't want to have to go into that. I would lie because I just didn't feel like going into the whole story. And to continue the legacy of this secret sister, it's been difficult. So I'm sort of glad that hopefully people will see this. Maybe it doesn't have to be such a big secret anymore.
She's like my best friend now.
Oh, now it's a loving relationship.
So whatever happened to all the data that was collected?
The data was a mess. It was just not well organized. They didn't really seem to have an understanding of the proper way to handle it from a scientific viewpoint. They were threatened with lawsuits, and nothing was published.
With permission, I did request the video footage for Kathy and Laurie, but I was told that due to privacy concerns, they couldn't actually share the data with anyone else.
So people wonder, so what can we do now? The first thing is we can make sure that every twin who was involved in the study knows it. They have a right to find out what the findings are when they participate in a study and then say, you can publish that, you should publish that, I want that never released, or whatever they wish.
At this point, all of the data have been sequestered, placed under seal at the Yale University archives, not to be opened until the year 2065. And the researchers who were now deceased had claimed that this was done to protect the twins. I do not believe that for a minute. I believe it was done to protect themselves.
It obviously is a subject of wonder. Why keep the records of the research under seal? I think the only explanation I can come up with is embarrassment.
For the families, questions persist, and the experiment has cast a long shadow.
Makes me emotional thinking about it because it's just something that I just believe you don't do to people. And I think being fraternal twins, like we felt we were collateral damage in this whole Louise Wise scheme.
I would say it was challenging enough being an adopted child, and to deprive me of being a twin and having a sister was just horrible.
In the name of scientific research, they had essentially exploited these families without ever using the data.
There really are no insights. We don't know what's in there. And if we were to get access to it and publish it, perhaps, what kind of message did that send to future researchers? I think that just because you can do a study doesn't mean that you should. And I still think that it stands as a great example of how not to do research. This should never, ever, ever be done.